The literature of the past always informs and shapes our understanding of the present. The COVID-19 pandemic is what led me to Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which describes the impact on London of the Great Plague of 1665. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were a transformative revolutionary time, politically, financially, scientifically, technologically. Defoe himself was one of the products of this era. He was an entrepreneur, not terribly successfully. He ended up bankrupt on several occasions. He was a politician, again, not with great success, ending up in prison more than once for upsetting people in power. He was a campaigning journalist, and more famous today as the author of what is seen as the first novel written in the English language, Robinson Crusoe, and soon after that, Moll Flanders. The novel itself was very much part of an artistic revolution. Since time immemorial, art, literature, in the form of poetry and drama in particular, had been focused on gods and heroes, kings, queens, aristocrats, the nobility. The novel was about ordinary men, ordinary women. And what Defoe was interested in was how ordinary men and women survived extraordinary challenges without losing their sense of identity and individuality. Published in the same year as Moll Flanders, the Journal of the Plague Year is a really interesting text, far less well known than either Robinson Crusoe or Moll Flanders. It's an almost postmodern hybrid of novel, history, autobiographical and journalism, blurring the boundaries between all four of those different art forms. But it's no less preoccupied by human resilience in the face of extremity than any of Defoe's famous novels. It was written 57 years after the plague itself, which had killed 100,000 people in London and thousands more throughout the country, approximately 2.5% of the population. It was the last significant outbreak of bubonic plague in England. This had begun with the Black Death in 1347, over 3 centuries before. And interestingly enough, the gap between the Black Death and the Great Plague is almost exactly the same time period as between the Great Plague and our own situation today. During the plague itself, Defoe himself was just a young boy, 5 years old. He'd been evacuated very quickly from London. His own memories of the plague must have been rather vague and very sort of partial. And yet the Journal of the Plague Year is narrated by a first-person narrator from the perspective of an adult remaining in London, referred to throughout only as HF. Defoe's uncle, Henry Foe, Defoe himself later added the DE at the beginning to make it sound more French, more sophisticated, remained in London during the plague and survived. And it's thought that HF is a tribute to Defoe's uncle. The journal, as we've already said, combines family memoir, combines novel, historical research. It's packed with accurate statistics and true stories, but also what nowadays we might call imaginative reconstructions, bringing a kind of fictive truth alongside the facts and figures with which Defoe is so fascinated. Obviously today, much of our fascination with the journal derives from parallels between our own experiences and those of our forebears 3.5 centuries ago. Social distancing and self-isolation were clearly just as central to their lives as to ours. The narrator describes how the best physic against the plague is to run away from it. People walked in the middle of the great street, neither on one side or other. They would not mingle with anybody, would stand and look at them, and sometimes talk with them at some space between. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of COVID-19 has been the fact that those most seriously ill cannot be visited in hospital by close relatives. Interestingly, Defoe describes how people, when they have had the distemper, have been so far from being forward to infect others, they have forbid their own family to come near them, and have even died without seeing their nearest relations, lest they be instrumental to give them the distemper, but sent his blessings and prayers for them by the nurse, who spoke it to them at a distance. This passage particularly resonated with me, having seen some really quite poignant photographs of people saying goodbye to loved ones via a nurse holding up a phone or an iPad, or so being able to communicate through technology, but still that distance, that physical distance, that unable to communicate with their own close relatives physically. And I think, again, it's just interesting through across those centuries, that sort of similar experience being expressed in Defoe's journal. Just as there are disagreements now about the right time to end what we now call lockdown, there were disagreements in the late 17th century. The narrator is quite critical of those who were in charge in London, the mayor and others. He says, for want of timely entering into measures and management, such a prodigious number of people suck in that disaster, which if proper steps had been taken, might have been avoided. Criticising them for being too slow to force people off the streets and into isolation, to shut down shops and other sort of public places. And very similar sort of accusations and counter-accusations have been made in our own time about the timing of the initial lockdown. Similarly, just as now there's a great debate going on here and in other countries, the USA particularly at the moment, about the right time to go back to normal, to return to the workplace, to schools and other institutions. There were disagreements in the 1660s. Defoe's narrator talks about how physicians, doctors, were telling people how relapse might be more fatal and dangerous than the whole visitation had been already. But it was all to no purpose. They opened shops, went about the streets, and conversed with anybody that came in their way to converse with. This imprudent, rash conduct cost a great many their lives, who had with great care and caution shut themselves up and kept retired from all mankind, and had by that means been preserved through all the heat of that infection. He's very struck by the irony that after all those months of self-isolating, of protecting themselves, people had just had enough, went back into the workplace too soon, with tragic results from that. He's also very mindful. There's been a lot of talk in the press in recent weeks about what COVID-19 exposes about social inequalities in our society, things perhaps we already knew about, but were sort of perhaps not quite so prominent or clear in people's minds. He describes, Defoe, how the richer sort of people thronged out of town with their families and servants, all hurrying away. The poor were pushed into any kind of business, the most dangerous and the most liable to infection. He's talking about how it's the very poorest in London society who have to do the jobs of burying the dead, delivering goods, caring for those who are sick. And again, we see very sort of considerable similarities in our own time with the fact that so many of the most dangerous and the most exposed jobs are done by those who are most socially vulnerable in society. And equally, criticism of those who have been going off to second homes or other places where they are perhaps not always welcomed by the local population who've lived there already. So again, we see these really interesting parallels between our own time and that of our ancestors 300 years before. Times such as ours tend to bring out the best and the most inspiring in human behaviour, but also can sometimes be slightly dispiriting, less inspiring. Just as people now have been extraordinarily impressed by the courage and dedication of the health workers, they were really just as much appreciated during the Great Plague as they are now. Defoe's narrator talks about how physicians ventured their lives so far as even to lose them in the service of mankind. There were many instances of immovable affection, pity, and duty in many. And of course, this week we've had a moment of silence just the other day for the many healthcare workers and other care workers who've died, given their lives to help others. And things were no different, really, in the admiration felt by people in London in the 1660s. But also at the same time, just as we have in our own time, people who are prepared, unscrupulous individuals, to hawk false cures for COVID-19, to exploit the fears or anxieties of others. Defoe talks about the people who ran to conjurers and witches and all sorts of deceivers who kept them always alarmed in order to pick their pockets. And there have been some horrendous stories as well in the press about individuals who sort of coughing or spitting on other people cruelly, claiming to be passing on the virus. And Defoe's narrator, HF, talks about a man who kissed a woman and, which was worst of all, told her he had the plague and why should she have it as well as he. Just as people now have to be very inventive and have come up with all sorts of extraordinary ways to get around the problems of social distancing, isolation. We have contactless payment now. They didn't have that in the 17th century, but that didn't stop one butcher who would not touch the money but have it put into a pot full of vinegar. He takes up the purse with the tongues and shakes the money out. So again, throughout human history, we can see that in the sort of space of extreme and challenging circumstances, human ingenuity and inventiveness will always win out. One of the situations, or the problems of the situation we're in, is the sense of anxiety and worry caused by the situation that we're in at the moment. Defoe talks about that sort of human shift from complacency to anxiety. He talks about how for a long time, and perhaps we felt the same ourselves here as we watched this illness, disease, the other side of the world, that people in London had a mighty fancy they should not be visited, or at least that it would not be so violent among them. However, very, very soon, people become equally convinced that, of course, they all have the illness, they have the sickness. It was a very ill time to be sick in, for if anyone complained, it was immediately said that he had the plague. I was not without apprehension that I really was infected. Part of the power of the narrative is this first-person narrator who gives us this very sort of inside personal account of what it must have been like to be in London in that period. That sense of anxiety, that sense of fear and worry, never quite sure whether he would be the next person to be infected. And of course, part of that anxiety comes from the invisibility of the plague, the fact that it can be passed on by what nowadays we would refer to as asymptomatic carriers. The narrator talks about how the infection was propagated insensibly and by such persons as were not visibly infected, who neither knew who they infected or who they were infected by. We see men alive and well to outward appearance 1 hour and dead the next. And of course, he's very alive to the sort of tragic irony of the fact that people would be passing on this illness, this disease, without having any idea that that's what they were doing. That just as now, a lot of the people who were carrying the plague would be people who had no visible signs of it. And he'd talk about how a person had been a walking destroyer, perhaps for a week or fortnight, how he'd ruined those that he would have hazarded his life to save. And I think a lot of the journal makes it so powerful. It's full of sort of numbers and statistics and all sorts of fascinating facts and figures. But it's some of these sort of personal, emotive moments which really get inside the psychology of the people affected that makes it such a powerful book, even 300 years after it was written. The other thing, of course, that's interesting about this age, we tend to think of the late 1600s, not unreasonably, as a religious time, a time much more religious than our own. This was just after the English Civil War, which had been driven in so many ways by different religious beliefs and ideologies. However, it was also the century of the scientific revolution. HF notes, we must consider the plague as it was really propagated by natural means. No one in this whole nation ever received the sickness or infection, but who received it in the ordinary way of infection from some body that was infected before. There are a few passages in this journal where he does talk about feeling sinful or needing forgiveness from God, but they're almost quite cursory passages. Throughout most of the text, he's far more interested in this idea as a scientific phenomenon, something that needs to be cured by medicine or science. And really interesting, this is the age of optics, this is the age of Newton, the age of the telescope, and of course the pioneering years of the microscope. And he talks at one stage, really fascinating to me, about how there might living creatures be seen by a microscope of strange, monstrous and frightful shapes. And of course, this is speculation, but the fact that already you can see the scientific mind at work, it doesn't make it any less scary. It's still referred to as something monstrous and strange, but we're looking now at scientific explanations here in the 1660s and early 1700s, rather than religious explanations of what's going on. This may be the tail end of the Black Death, the tail end of the bubonic plague, but it's also the early years of our own era. We're still in the age of science. Throughout the book, there is this sort of fascination with numbers and figures, and just as every day, really, we in the press and the press briefings have these daily governmental updates on the latest numbers of fatalities. Defoe's narrative is punctuated by what he calls the bills, daily and weekly tallies of the dead. And there were also concerns then, just as there are now, that the numbers were being quite significantly underreported. He writes that it was found there were more who were dead of the plague that had been set down of the spotted fever or other distempers, besides others concealed. And the overwhelming numbers just become too much at one stage. The funerals became so many that people could not toll the bell, mourn or weep or wear black for one another as they did before. No, nor so much as make coffins for those that died. And there's some sort of very uncomfortable parallels really with our own times. We've sort of seen images of bodies being taken out of hospitals, kept in containers, mass funerals, people unable to sort of hold funerals or significant funerals because of the sheer numbers involved, as well as the nature of the disease. And again, we see those parallels those years before. The journal ends on a sort of cautionary note. He writes that, "I wish I could say that as the city had a new face, so the manners of people had a new appearance. The general practice of the people was just as it was before, and very little difference was to be seen. There did not cease the spirit of strife, which was really the great troubler of the nation's peace before." He's talking here about the period just after the plague really was over. The spirit of strife, he's sort of referring to that period just before the English Civil War. There was hope in the 1665 during the plague amongst many people that things might change. There'd been a lot of sense of togetherness. There'd been a lot of working together to fight this plague, to help each other. There'd been huge amounts of human self-sacrifice, extraordinary courage shown. And just as now there's been so much hope expressed that once the current crisis has passed, we can transform ourselves, our society, our world for the better, perhaps changing the way we live, changing our attitudes, and even maybe some of our values. There was that hope at that time. And Defoe ends on this rather sceptical, perhaps rather defeated note. He's writing 57 years after the plague, when very little had really changed, perhaps perceptibly for the better, however much of a revolutionary period it had been. And of course, this just reminds us, that we don't have to, just because we learn from the past, we don't have to necessarily follow it. That one of the most important things we can learn from history is how not to repeat it. Thank you very much for listening.